Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Kellie. Kellie, welcome to the show.
Hi, Benjamin. I'm glad to be here, and it's good to be connecting with you.
Yeah, Kellie, thank you so much for the time. I am excited for this episode. I think it's going to be very insightful and really helpful. But before we dive into the subject, we always like to get to know our guests. So tell us about your work history and your career and all that kind of fun stuff.
Well, the part of my work history that I think is germane to today is that we're going to be talking about communication. We'll talk about trust a bit. I led a comms team in a global financial services company during the global financial crisis, 2008. And so, it's one of those situations where you're just waking up, you're going to work, and then all of a sudden, everything about your job and what you're challenged to do, the whole script has been flipped. And what you really need to do is try to connect meaningfully with people. It's very hard in a heavily regulated industry to make these types of adjustments that you want to make. But you also can't really offer a panacea for people because you don't have any control over what's happening with the market. But it did unearth within me a deeper desire to understand, what is trust? How do we communicate trust? What are the facets of that? And so that enables me to talk with you today about the things that we'll cover right now. And I work now as a consultant, which I love, popping in and out of organizations and helping them with what they have going on.
I love it. And as you said, we're going to talk about trust today and how specifically businesses can build trust. Now, first and foremost, it feels like more than ever, it is essential for businesses to build trust. How do we start to build that trust? I feel like the term can be vague sometimes. You know it if you've got it, and you know it if you don't. But how do we start to actually build this and create a tangible process to have businesses gain trust?
Yes. And so I guess the first question as a communicator, and I know this will resonate with you, is when I hear you ask that question, I think, okay, is this internally or externally? Because there's two different answers, right? So I'm gonna start with and focus on internal. Is that sort of where you were leaning?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So internally, I think that trust is the lifeblood of any organization. But because what gets measured gets done, and trust rarely gets measured, our focus on trust tends to be one where we don't really look at it until we desperately need it. And then we're suddenly trying to figure out, how do we obtain that? What is it? Why is it disappearing? One thing that neuroscience tells us about trust is that when people go through prolonged periods of stress, chronic stress, they produce less oxytocin in the brain. Now, this enables us to experience trust. So extending trust, fortifying trust, all of this depends on oxytocin. And when that's inhibited in the brain, trust does start to fray. Now, that's going to happen in small ways in organizations, but it's going to be little disagreements or people not giving someone the benefit of the doubt. It's these little tiny pieces of friction that are happening that don't enable work to flow both at the speed and at the collaborative quality that it's capable of. So these things are happening incrementally. They're already at play in organizations. I've already heard anecdotally people leaving meetings and thinking, whoa, that's a tone I haven't heard in a meeting before. Because, we have different levels of self-awareness. It's also important to keep in mind that Gallup is one of the many organizations that measure loneliness. And 1 in 5 people in the US experiencing loneliness on a daily basis. The problem with that is that when we feel lonely, our threat response goes up. We are a social being. We are happiest and we are healthiest when we feel connected to others. And when we feel lonely, we feel less safe. So our hypervigilance causes us to receive others or to see other things with a greater tendency towards a threat response. So these two things combined just reveal what challenges are kind of bubbling up within organizations today. What can we do about it, specifically in the world of communication, right? So we find that organizations that do best in terms of high trust cultures, they communicate really well around what's called procedural fairness. And so that's really what's being decided and why. Real clarity around what's being decided and why that's being decided. And there's research that shows, going all the way back to the 1990s, that when decision was made in an organization to cut people's salaries, when it was communicated extremely well to employees, that their receptivity, although massively disappointed, was much more accepting. So those pieces that we know and we honor around clarity and really communicating the why of a decision, these are things that as communicators we have to really advocate for right now, because we need to make sure that our organizations stay healthy in terms of the flow of information.
I love that. So for me, one of the strongest elements of a business is having a really developed diversity of thought, having people with crazy different backgrounds, life experiences, perspectives, political, religious, and other beliefs, and bringing those to the table to better represent a different way of thinking, and hopefully discovering how the audience, and even though we often in marketing say, oh, our audience thinks this way, really, like, your audience is built into a million different, micro segments of how people look and think and everything like that. How do we embrace the diversity of thought internally while still aligning, making decisions, and giving people the psychological safety to actually share those things? Sometimes I feel like we're kind of juggling several balls in the air and we're not sure how to manage that. What's your perspective, and how do we really embrace the one side while kind of protecting the other?
Right. So with psychological safety, what Amy Edmondson says, and she's the one that coined the term, I think the term that she coined was actually like psychological team safety. With that, we have to bear in mind that there's a real asymmetry between voice and choice. So the organization benefits tremendously when you voice your concern. So when you stand up and you voice your concern, you support, you help the organization. But the individual benefits from silence. The individual benefits from staying quiet. The individual benefits from not provoking conflict, from not creating tension with their peers. So that's something that we have to stay aware of, is that people are more advantaged personally to keep their thoughts to themselves. And so the efforts around psychological safety, and it's very clear in the literature what you need to do to facilitate psychological, it's effortful. Now, it happens to also be a lot of things that enhance trust. So when we want to create an environment where people feel that they are doing well both personally and professionally, and this is a hallmark of a high trust organization, according to research, that in order to do that, we have to facilitate team engagement that enables people to bring their full selves to the table, right? And so some of that is about turn taking, making sure everybody who's in a meeting gets to participate fully, but also that you are unpacking things beyond just the task, the everyday task of work. So that relationship piece that comes in is really important. Another thing that is really popular right now in the science of well-being is looking at awe, experiences that elicit an awe, the response of awe. And we tend to think about those. For me, my first thought is like going to Yosemite, right? Looking out at something expansive and magnificent. But the lead researcher in this space, Dasher Keltner, has recently discovered that we on an everyday basis are more likely to experience awe through relationship, through witnessing moral acts of beauty in other people. So when someone else makes an effort to be truly kind to someone else, anyone who witnesses that or hears of it or learns about it experiences awe. And what's great about that is those experiences produce the same brain chemical that is inhibited by chronic stress. So experiences of awe now are producing the oxytocin that we need, and that facilitates trust. So it puts us into a more virtuous cycle as an organization when we encourage each other to just do intentional things that feel good, and then we make space to talk about that and allow that to resonate within our workspace.
I love that. That makes perfect sense. That's a wonderful, beautiful answer. I love that. With companies working more remotely as of late, ever since COVID, more and more companies, you get to work from home. How do we have those moments where we can see the awe or the acts of kindness. I love like the beautiful morality of what you're talking about. How do we better let people experience those when you're in a digital environment and you may not see it as much because you're not in the same physical space as one another? Any recommendations for organizations that may be hybrid or remote and how they can have those beautiful moments and then build that unity?
I think the first thing is when we say that we want to prioritize these types of experiences, then we just intentionally build them into our calendar. And I don't think that's particularly helpful if you have a task oriented meeting and then you ask people to set aside 5 minutes to share something personally meaningful, or a time when they did something, right, that was outside of the ordinary, or something that was truly character revealing. But if you set up those engagements together and maybe you say, we meet weekly to focus on tasks, 1 week out of the month is going to be a place where either one, you're going to share something about yourself that we don't know. Come to the table and tell us something we don't know. And then we facilitate learning and questioning around that. We individuals become the center of that. Another thing that can be done is Dasher Keltner talks a lot about experiencing awe in nature, and that each of us can have a task for that week to experience something in nature, to bring that back and to share that with each other. And that becomes an intentional effort. So that's just one idea, is taking those weekly cadences. And now we're going to say, listen, we understand that our well-being is central to our ability to be highly productive and to collaborate and to strengthen the ties between us while we're getting work done. So we're actually going to make space in our calendar that's just about that.
I really love that. I've heard the term random acts of kindness, and sometimes marketers joke around about random acts of marketing and things like that. I love that you are taking the opportunities to make it intentional and purposeful. You're actually scheduling those moments and encouraging it and building a culture there. I think that's super, super cool. So I want to shift gears just a little bit because we're running out of time. I have one other question for you. For all the individuals listening to this episode thinking, okay, I would really like to be in an environment where I feel safe, where I feel heard, where we can have meaningful discussions and I don't feel shot down. And like you said, don't have that experience of walking out of a meeting and being like, wow, that was a bad experience. Or wow, I feel so unheard or so unseen at this moment in time. For marketers who are wondering, okay, well, how's that going to affect the bottom line? How's that going to affect our audience?
Yeah, it does.
What's your opinion on what happens to a brand when their employees experience this level of trust and safety and unity? How does that start to actually manifest itself in our content and in our brand and in our external appearance to the world and to our audiences? How does that even make an impact, in your opinion?
Okay, so that's really interesting. So just to play that question back, you're saying when we get it right internally, when we put the effort in and we build the high trust environment, how does that manifest? How does the brand express itself in ways that people can? I think that's a phenomenal question. I would love to take on that project.
Wouldn't that be a fun research study to do or something like that?
Project. Yeah. I think the first thing that occurs to me is that we have more cognitive energy to devote to understanding the human experience with our brand, as opposed to just getting the work done. We can more readily and more easily think about that human experience on the other end, regardless of what touch point, right, that we're talking about. And so one thing that you and I have talked about a lot, which is just a favorite topic of mine, is segmentation. Doesn't sound like fun, but it really is. Particularly that super geeky word, psychographic segmentation. I just love, because what that really means is that we stop treating people like a marketing target and we treat them as a fully formed human being with fears and hopes. And trust is really that intersection, right, of people's highest hopes and their deepest fears. And when we want to understand how they're operating and what's going to really turn them on and turn them off, we have to see the context of their lives and how the thing that we make fits within the context of their lives. And that's all a lot more complicated than the simple variables, right? Those simple variables around geography, where somebody lives, how much money they make, what their gender is, right? So psychographic segmentation really challenges us to work with much more complex variables. And so I would just say that when we create a high trust environment, we don't have people who are struggling with how uncertainty reduces our ability to kind of think clearly and make clean, clear judgments, how it slows us down. Instead, we're operating at a place of a higher performance, and the research shows that. So the higher level of quality and the higher level of quantity of work that we can produce would manifest itself through the depth, and the quality of brand experiences that we manifest by being able to truly put people at the center of our decisions, other people.
I love that. That's amazing. That's so cool. Well, Kellie, unfortunately, we have run out of time for this episode today, but thank you for your insights. I think there are several moments in this podcast where people are going to say, you know what? I can do a little bit better. And I think that's exactly what we're shooting for today. Kellie, if anyone wants to reach out and connect with you online, how and where can they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Kellie Cummings.
And we will link to Kellie in the show notes below for anyone listening. Again, Kellie, thank you so much for the time and insights today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Benjamin.